Greetings. The last time Jesus was in Nazareth with Eliud still, and he was invited to go speak to some intellectuals. Yes. He went to entertain William Buckley and some of his guests. Actually, there were Pharisees, and they were he was talking to physicians and whatnot. And he also gave Eliud a preview of the transfiguration as a grace because Eliud would not live to see the crucifixion. So now we're in the middle of September and we're keeping on going. So Friday, September 16th, 29 AD, the Jewish month of Elul 19. In the morning I saw Jesus and Eliud arrive at a shepherd field. It was daybreak, and the shepherds were already out of their huts and with the cattle. They came forward to meet Jesus, who was known to them. They cast themselves down before him and then led him and his companion under a shed where they had their cooking utensils. Here they washed their feet, prepared for them a couch, and set before them bread and a little drinking cup for each of them. They roasted some turtle doves for their guests. The birds had their nests in the roofs of the huts and were hopping around in great numbers like hens. And now I saw Jesus dismissing Eliud, who knelt to receive his blessing. The shepherds were present. Jesus told him that he would end his days in peace, that the path which he himself had to walk would be too difficult for him, and that he had admitted him to his community, that he had already done his part in the vineyard, and that he should receive his reward in the kingdom. Jesus explained this by the parable of the laborers in the vineyards. Eliud was very grave since the vision of the preceding night, very silent and deeply impressed. I think he was afterward baptized by the disciples. He accompanied Jesus a part of the way from the shepherd field. The Lord embraced him, and he departed with signs of manly emotion. The place to which Jesus was going for the Sabbath could be seen from here. Some of his relatives once dwelt there. The place to which he now went alone was called Gur. It was built on a mountain. Joseph's brother, who afterward removed to Zebulun and who had had frequent communication with the Holy Family, once dwelt there. Jesus went unnoticed to an inn, where they washed his feet and presented him food. He had a chamber to himself. He caused a roll of the scriptures to be brought to him from the synagogue, and out of it he read and prayed, sometimes standing, sometimes kneeling, often raising his eyes towards heaven. He did not go to the school. Once I saw some people going to the inn and asking to speak to Jesus, but he would not see them. Subtext: a glance at the disciples going to the baptism. I saw the disciples whom Jesus had dispatched with messages arrive in Capernaum. They were about 5 of the best known. They had an interview with Mary, and then 2 of them went to Bethsaida for Peter and Andrew. James the Less, Simon, Thaddeus, John, and James the Greater were present. The disciples spoke of the mildness, meekness, and wisdom of Jesus, while the followers of John the Baptist proclaimed with enthusiasm the austere life of their master and declared that they had never before heard such an interpreter of the law and the prophets. Even John spoke enthusiastically of the Baptist, although he already knew Jesus. His parents had once lived only a couple of hours from Nazareth, and Jesus loved him even as a child. The disciples celebrated the Sabbath here. The next day I saw the 9 disciples, along with those named above, on the road to Tiberias, whence they were to go to John, passing near Ephron, and then through the desert toward Jericho. Peter and Andrew particularly distinguished themselves by the zeal with which they spoke of the Baptist. He was, they said, of a noble priestly race. He had been educated by the Essenes in the wilderness. He would suffer no irregularity around him. He was as rigorous as he was wise. Then Jesus' disciples put forward the mildness and wisdom of their master, to which the others retorted that many disorders arose from such condescension, and they cited instances of proof of what they said. Jesus' disciples replied that their master too had been educated by the Essenes, and that, moreover, he had but lately returned from traveling. But John entered not into this discussion. I did not hear him saying anything more in that strain. She's talking of John the Apostle. They started together for the place of baptism, but after a few hours took different directions. As I listened to their conversation, I thought, men were then as they now are. Nothing changes. Saturday, September 17th. Subtext, Jesus in Gophna. Oh, there's nothing here. I guess this was the second day the disciples are traveling. Sunday, September 18th. Gur, where Jesus prayed alone in the inn, lay not very far from a city, Megiddo, and a field of the same name. I have clearly seen that toward the end of the world there will be fought in that field a battle with Antichrist, i.e. Armageddon. Jesus arose with the dawn, rolled up his couch, laid a coin on it, girded himself, and went forth. His way led him around many towns and villages, but he met no one, put up at no inn. He passed Mount Gerizim near Samaria, which lay to the left as he journeyed southward. Occasionally, he ate a few berries and some other fruit, and in the hollow of his hand, or with a concave leaf, scooped up some water to quench his thirst. Toward evening, Jesus entered Gophna, a city on Mount Ephron. It was built upon very jagged foundations, some high, some low, numerous gardens and pleasure grounds scattered between the houses. Some relatives of Joachim dwelt there, but they had not maintained intimate communications with the Holy Family. Jesus put up at an inn where they washed his feet and gave him some little refreshment. But soon there came to the inn some of his relatives accompanied by a couple of Pharisees of the better sort, and escorted him to their own home, one of the handsomest houses in the city. The city itself was of some importance, and possessed at this time jurisdiction over a portion of the country around. Jesus' relative was an official, and was much employed in writing. I think the city belonged to Samaria. Jesus was received with respect. There were several guests at his relative's house, and all, standing or walking, took refreshments in a pleasure garden. Jesus slept here overnight. It was a day's journey from Gophna to Jerusalem. There was a little river in this region. During the loss of the boy Jesus in the temple, the Holy Family had gone to Gophna in search for him. For when they missed him at Michmas, they thought he might perhaps have gone to his relatives there. Mary feared that he had fallen into the little river. Monday, September 19th. Jesus, having gone to the synagogue, asked for the writings of one of the prophets, and taught of baptism and the Messiah. He proved to his hearers from the prophets that the time must have arrived for his appearance. He cited events which were to precede his coming and which had already actually been accomplished, alluding especially to one that had happened 3 years before. I do not now remember whether that particular event was a war or whether it was that the scepter had passed from Judah. And so he went on enumerating proofs of accomplished signs which were to precede the coming of the Messiah. He mentioned also the multiplication of sects and the irreligious nature of so many of their ceremonies. He told them that the Messiah would be in their midst and they would not know him. He alluded, in words something like the following, to the connection existing between himself and John. There will be one who will point him out, that is the Messiah, but ye will not acknowledge him. Ye wish to see a conqueror, an illustrious personage, a man surrounded by magnificence and eminently learned companions. Ye will not recognize as the Messiah one that comes among you destitute of wealth and authority, unattended by the pomp of worldly splendor and magnificence, one whose companions are unlettered peasants and laborers, whose followers are made up of beggars, cripples, lepers, and sinners. In this way, Jesus spoke at length, interpreting the prophecies and putting forth clearly the connection between himself and John the Baptist. Still, he never once said, I, but spoke of himself in the third person. His instruction occupied the greater part of the day. His relatives concluded that he must be an envoy, a forerunner of the expected Messiah. On his return to their house, they referred to a book in his presence wherein they had recorded all that had happened in the temple to Jesus, the son of Mary, in his 12th year. They were struck by the similarity between what he had then said and his teaching of today, and on perusal of that record, they were still more astonished. The father of the house was an aged widower. His 2 daughters, both widows, lived with him. I heard the 2 daughters talking together of the marriage of Joseph and Mary in Jerusalem, at which they had been present. They recalled the magnificence of that wedding, how well off Anne had been, but how changed the circumstances of the family had become. They spoke just as people of the world are accustomed to do, a vein of blame and reproach running through their words, as if they of whom they were speaking had greatly degenerated. While thus conversing and, womanlike, recounting the particulars of the wedding and Mary's bridal dress, I saw the circumstantial vision of the whole ceremony and especially of the Blessed Virgin's ornaments. Meanwhile, the men were hunting up what had been written years before about Jesus and his teaching as a boy in the temple. The parents of Jesus had anxiously sought him here, and it was thus that the news of where and how he was found had reached them. The affair had attracted much attention, especially as he was a relative of theirs. While his relatives were still expressing surprise at the connection between his former and his present teaching, by which they were even more prejudiced in his favor, Jesus informed them that he must take leave and, in spite of the remonstrances, set out accompanied by several of the men. They had to cross a little river over a bridge of masonry on which trees were growing. They journeyed some hours to a plain covered with meadows. It was here the patriarch Joseph was when Jacob sent him to his brethren in Shechem. The regions from which Jesus had lately come had been much frequented by Jacob. Late in the evening, Jesus entered a shepherd village this side of a small river, and his companions left him. The village lay on both sides of the river, the part on the opposite bank being the larger. The synagogue was on this side. The Lord went to an inn where were assembled two sets of candidates for baptism. They were on their way through the desert to the appointed place. They had spread the news here of Jesus' coming. He conversed with them that evening, and they departed next morning. The servants washed the Lord's feet. He partook of a light repast, and then retired for prayer and rest. Subtext: Jesus condemns Herod's adultery, the journey of the holy women. Tuesday, September 20th. Next morning, Jesus went to the school where many were assembled. He spoke as usual of the baptism and of the nearness of the Messiah, whom they would not acknowledge. He reproached them for their obstinate adherence to old meaningless customs, on which point these people had a special failing. They were, on the whole, tolerably simple-minded and received his remonstrances well. Jesus requested the high priest of the synagogue to conduct him to the sick. He visited about 10, but cured none. For in the neighborhood of Jerusalem he had told Eliud and his 5 disciples that he would perform no more cures until he had been to the baptism. The sick in this place were mostly dropsical, gouty, and infirm women. Jesus exhorted them and told them separately what religious acts they should perform, according as their infirmities were in part punishment of sin. Some he ordered to purify themselves and go to the baptism. There was a meal prepared for him at the inn, at which many of the men of the place were present. Before the hour for it, these men spoke of Herod, of his unlawful connection with his brother's wife, blaming him severely, and inquiring into Jesus' opinion on the point in question. Jesus heatedly censured Herod's conduct and denounced the sin of adultery, but he told them likewise that if they judged others, they would themselves be judged. Now, there were in this place many sinners. Jesus spoke with them privately and earnestly reproved them for living in adultery. He told many all their secret sins. Trembling with fear, they promised to do penance. Jesus went from here to Bethany, a distance of perhaps 6 miles, and again entered a mountainous region. It was the winter season, foggy and cloudy by day and sometimes white frost by night. Jesus enveloped his head in a scarf and journeyed straight on toward the east. I saw Mary and 4 holy women leaving the house and wending their way through a field near Tiberias. They had with them 2 servants from the fishery. One went on ahead, the other followed, both laden with baggage which they carried on a pole across the shoulder, a pack in front and another behind. The 4 women were Johanna Chusa, Mary Cleophas, Mary Salome, and one of the 3 widows. They too were going to Bethany by the usual route, which ran by Shechem to the right. When Jesus passed it, it was on his left. The holy women walked generally in single file, a couple of steps apart. They went in this way probably because most of the roads, excepting the broad highways, were narrow, intended for foot passengers, and led through the mountains. They walked quickly with a firm step, not swaying from side to side as the country people do here. Very probably this is because from early youth the inhabitants of that country are accustomed to making long journeys on foot. They had their gowns tucked up to about the middle of the calf, their lower limbs bandaged tightly down to the ankle, and bound to the soles of their feet were thick padded sandals. Over the head was a veil, the ends of which were fastened into the scarf wound round the neck. This scarf was crossed on the breast, thence carried behind and caught in the girdle. Sometimes the wearers ran their hands down into the folds and there let them rest. The man, going on before the travelers, prepared the way for them. He opened the hedges, removed stones from the path, laid bridges, gave orders at the inns, and, in fine, saw to everything. The one who followed put everything again into its first order. And I will terminate the reading here. So, we have arrived to the notes. I got a few. First thing, feet washing seems to be a common thing, but for good reason. If, as she says, these people often traveled by foot and footwear was less than ideal, then feet would obviously, first of all, become well calloused, which probably wasn't a joy to wash. The second of all, feet and ankles would get pretty swollen. Now, we have good running shoes or sneakers in our times, but even then, it takes the best in order to not get your feet sore after you've walked. Good example of this, when you go golfing, you can walk between 6,000 and 7,000 yards, which is just north of 4 miles if you're walking 7,000. And Jesus on his ministry is probably walking, I estimate, between 5 to 15 miles a day, and he only wore sandals, as she pointed out last time, because she was contrasting. There was a fancy shoe that people around Judea were wearing, Judea, Galilee, Israel were wearing, but Jesus was only wearing sandals. So he probably had sore feet. There's a lot of other things. I don't remember where I read this. I do remember one spot, but I think I may have read it also in Mystical City, that he would often walk bare feet and he wouldn't leave footprints. Other than that, if he was in Mystical City, she would make it a point that they would often accept the inclemencies of the weather in order to prepare themselves for the sufferings of the cross, right? Mary and Jesus both. So they wouldn't mitigate their suffering. And perhaps he did actually suffer the sores of having walked all this much, the wear and tear. So, yeah, there's a lot of mystery there. As for feet washing, perhaps it was something like a Mick job back then, something everyone had to do as they climbed up the chain of command, in their family at least, because there wasn't as much social mobility back then. Anyways, next note, Jesus needed his alone time. I explained this before. We as humans, we have to spend a portion of our time in prayer so as to continuously rejuvenate our connection with God the Father. We at the church frequent the sacraments for this reason. This is what I call feeding a starving soul. Obviously, Jesus needed to feed his own soul as well. Couldn't just be around people all the time. Next note, I like how she points out how men and women behave differently, and she pointed to men, like how Jesus and Eliud departed and how the apostles act. And then she talked about how the women gossiped about the Holy Family, the relations of Christ. Now, for men, their emotional language really hasn't changed much from now, but probably neither sex, I should say. The emotional language probably hasn't changed much since the time of Noah. These days, some men are, however, raised by single mothers and without fathers. And what tends to psychologically happen to them is that they crave the attention of friends and give their friends a high sense of importance, probably more than they ought to have. And maybe this is like a survival mechanism because they're looking for what they lost in their father out of their friends. And they can get it, but the friends have to be somewhat severe with them. Now, I've made friends with boys who've had fathers, and I've made friends with boys who did not, who've had somewhat estranged relationships with their fathers. And I have found that boys who had fathers tended to form probably better brotherhoods. Like their emotional language between one another was more manly, less candid. So there was a lot of silence that passed between them. So they'd tease one another, they'd insult one another, challenge each other, never took anything too personally. And this is the language of love between men who are well adjusted. But men who are primarily raised by women, they're easy to wound. They're more sensitive. You'd tease them and they'd remember it and they'd take it personally like you've insulted them. And they live in scorn against you and look to get you back like they're vengeful. And this is... And they take things way too seriously. So they're far less forgiving than typical boys are with each other. And they would apply invisible parameters with you, like, you're not a real friend if you do such and such. Well, so Jesus and Eliud, they both are well adjusted. Obviously, Jesus is God, so there's that. And he's not a bastard. My God is God the Father. Anyways, manly emotion would be about right. It means there was a mutual respect there. There were no tears. There's no, oh, I don't know when I'll see you again. No, there's none of that. Simply well wishes and a lot of unspoken outward signs of respect, like the claw handshake, where you hold your claw out in front of you and someone takes it, they palm your hand, and you just give each other kind of that half hug and you pat each other on the back, pretty powerfully, right? There's mutual respect. That's a brotherhood, right? And this is somewhat lacking in our time because of the amount of boys being raised in environments with estranged fathers. I loved the next note. I love the scene with the disciples. I remember I'm listening to Father Michel Rodrigue, and I know there are various opinions on him. I'm not here to judge one way or another, but I do love listening to him talk because he has somewhat of a saintly gait about him. He's so innocent. And in one of those speeches, he jokes, when you were kids and you talk to other people and you'd like, my bear can bat your bear, my father can beat up your father there, eh? Well, it's true. When I was a kid, I was exactly like that. In grade 1 in elementary school, we had recess and stuff like that, so we'd be out in the yard and there was a bunch of kids there. Between grades 1 and 3, although in the back, sometimes the kids mingled more because we had 2 separate spots, the grades 1 and 3, grades 4 and 6. They were on the other side and we weren't supposed to go on that side, nor were they supposed to come on our side. Although in the middle, there was some mingling because we did know people from there. Like, for example, when I was in grade 1, my sister was in grade 6. So obviously there was some mingling there. Well, anyways, I did go up to the other kids and be like, my father is smarter than your father. Really? What grade is your father in? Things like that. My father can beat up your father. How do you know that? Well, anyways, here the apostles are sort of pitting Jesus against the Baptist, and it's amusing. And she notes it's like, they're just like here in our times. But here's John the Evangelist sort of caught in the middle. and he's probably getting quite amused by it all because he knows both of them. He knows Jesus and John the Baptist. There's a reason. This is the reason, though, that people like watching shows like The Chosen and movies like Jesus of Nazareth. It's just watching the apostles interact. And they're usually pretty good at this, despite all the heresies they put in the movies and in the shows. They're good at showing the human reactions of the apostles while they're witnessing God act. So there's this touching scene in Jesus of Nazareth where Matthew and Peter are reconciled. And later on, they're near the fire, and Peter had just sent, it was probably his son, back to Capernaum through the boat, and he was looking at the fire and contemplating it, and the character of Matthew says to him, "We'll never go back." And Peter's like, "I will." "No, you won't. None of us will. It's because we'll be the first to know." Right? It's because we enjoy those human interactions, even if they're fake, they're not real. We enjoy those disciple reactions because we would react like that. It gives us like this taste of what it would have been like to be an apostle. And this is how they say, men think about the Roman Empire once a week. Men romanticize about being an apostle of Jesus. I guarantee you, talk to any Catholic, they will say the same thing. Do you ever romanticize? Do you ever fantasize about being one of the 12? They'll probably say yes. Any good Catholic will probably say yes. So we're getting a genuine look here in this text, and probably in Maria Valtorta's work, the poem of the Man God, though I'm far less familiar with it. Mystical City, she doesn't deal with material affairs much. She does sometimes, but it's really not common. She'll only describe them in narration and passively. Here we're seeing a moment, and I'm glad I read this moment. Next note, when I read the word Megiddo, the first thing I thought of was Armageddon. It's the Battle of Megiddo Valley, which is a still standing prophecy today. And she mentions it right after she mentions Megiddo. So we may well see this prophecy fulfilled in our time. My guess, and it's a very educated guess, I would say, based on looking at yours from a prophetically mathematical point of view, but still a human guess, is that this war will actually take place around October of 2041. But hey, it's just a guess. I'm allowed. I won't get into how I discern that, but let's just say, I think I may have discovered a prophetic calendar. If the roses, they'll bloom. Now, he speaks of himself in third person. Yeah, I would too. First of all, he has to mitigate his language. First of all, because I said this before, he doesn't want to draw too much attention away from the Baptists. Right now, John the Baptist is center stage. He doesn't want to steal his thunder yet. Second of all, too much light blinds the eyes. He can't just go out telling people he's the Messiah right now. He has to ease it into the discussion. There's a mistake, people, in our time. Let's suppose you were in bad relationships in the past, and you're looking to meet someone new in a new relationship. We got to learn from Jesus here. Okay? There's telling the truth, and then there's vomiting the truth. Telling the truth is a truth in itself. It's an art. You have to tell it over time, and you can only tell as much as the other person you feel can handle. It is imprudent. Yes, it's a sin to tell too much truth at one time. The devil will actually tell you the truth, but he'll do it in an unartful way on purpose so as to cause you to have misleading thoughts about a subject. So the devil will tell you 100% of the truth, but he'll do it in a deceptive manner. When you tell the truth, you cannot vomit it. There is an art to it, and Jesus is practicing that art. So as I say here, too much light blinds the eyes. You can only ease it. Next, and we know, I mean, you're teasing other people. Let's say you have a flashlight and they're trying to read and you glint their eyes. You know what it does to them, okay? Truth is the same thing. You know that telling too much truth is going to scare people off sometimes. You don't want to pour out all your baggage on the first date. These things have to come out subtly. All right, so next note, the gossip was alive and well even among Jesus's relatives. This was an amusing tidbit. Reminds me of Pride and Prejudice. Now, I'm quite attached to this book. So the talks between Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, her sister, they have different last names, obviously, because they married different people. They're married into different families. Anyways, Jane Austen executed these dialogues perfectly because the women were extremely hypocritical. And an example is Mrs. Bennet's like, you know what? I was never too fond of that Mr. Wickham. But in truth, like in the earlier reading of the novel, she was quite fond of him. So, you know, they're just trying to protect their hide kind of thing. Well, here, and again, Anne Catherine is actually a contemporary of Jane Austen, but she's describing the gossip of Jesus's relatives in a very similar way, as if the Holy Family was living through scandal. Like when they only these relations only distanced themselves from the Holy Family because they were becoming poorer, and these people were probably afraid of the poverty. Anyways, next note. With what's going on in the hierarchy these days, especially since the US aid has been pulled, we're going to see a lot of ugly things about the church and the charities it has connected itself to be revealed. We've already seen a not so flattering side of the church reveal itself lately, and Jesus makes his point when talking about Herod and the adultery. The men asked his opinion. Now, Jesus condemns the adultery, but he told the men to be careful what they say because many of them were adulterers themselves. We are a bunch of sinners here. I'm a sinner. I will attest to that. And we have to watch what we say about the hierarchy because these are men ranked above us. We can condemn their errors, and you know that I'm well against illegal immigration. I think it is breaking the law. But we have to watch out not to spread unnecessary scandal. I don't cover it much because other Catholic podcasters with way more followers than I have, they talk about it a lot. They can risk their souls on the matter, but I will only say, listen to what they say, but don't do as they do. So the last thing, and I'll make this brief. She said it was the winter season, but I've been reading the dates, and it actually hadn't even arrived to the fall equinox. We're at September 20th around when she pointed this out. And so technically we're just at the end of summer at the start of fall. So where, quote unquote, I live, we get a cold spell and get frost in September. But my climate is a fair bit colder than that of Jerusalem. So I wonder at this. Now, I'm not accusing her of lying or anything like that. I'm just saying maybe they had a cold spell there, an oddball one. Because, well, here it's mid-February, the feast day of St. Valentine, and just stormed yesterday, and it's extremely windy outside, and it's -8. That's not accounting for wind chill, by the way. In Jerusalem, it's 12 degrees currently, 20 degrees warmer than here, and in our times, September's in Jerusalem range apparently from 16 to 28 degrees. If you're American, that's 61 to 82 Fahrenheit. Now, perhaps it was a fair bit colder back then, or perhaps they had a cold spell. So, anyway, that's that. Ave Maria.